The widow bought a ruined homestead for $12. Then a rich man rode out begging for her land. By sunset, every man in Silver Bend believed Ruth Mercer had thrown away the last $12 she owned. The county clerk laughed first. Then the two men waiting behind her laughed, because men like that always laughed when a woman stood alone at a counter with no husband beside her and no fear showing on her face. Ruth did not answer them. She only pressed her gloved hand flat on the deed and looked down at the name written there. Mercer. It had been her married name for 6 years. Now it was the name of a dead man, a cold grave in Kansas, and a debt collector's paper folded in the bottom of her traveling bag. $12, Clerk Holly said again, shaking his head like he wanted to hear the foolishness out loud. For the Harrow place. I heard you, Ruth said. It has no roof worth speaking of. I know. The well soured years ago. So I was told. And that land has not fed a goat since President Hayes was in office. Ruth lifted her eyes. They were not sharp eyes, not cruel ones, but they had the steady gray color of storm clouds that had decided where they meant to break. Then no one should miss it, she said. That ended the laughter for a moment. Outside, Silver Bend lay under a hard Wyoming wind. Dust moved low along the street, dragging bits of straw against the wagon wheels. A horse stamped near the hitching post. Somewhere down the road, a blacksmith's hammer rang with the lonely sound of a town trying to pretend it was stronger than the weather. Ruth signed the deed. Her hand trembled just once when she dipped the pen, not because she doubted herself. Doubt had burned out of her somewhere between the train from Abilene and the long stage ride north. Her hand trembled because Thomas Mercer should have been standing beside her. He would have leaned close, smelled of pine soap and tobacco, and whispered some foolish brave thing to make her smile. But Thomas was gone. So Ruth signed alone. Clerk Holly stamped the paper and slid it toward her as if it carried sickness. There, he said, 40 acres of bad grass, 1 broken house, 1 dead well, and more trouble than sense. Ruth folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside her coat. She had $9 left after the fee for a room at Mrs. Bell's boarding house. $9, 1 extra dress, a silver hair comb from her mother, and a small leather journal wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her bag. The journal was the reason she had come. It had belonged to her father, Elias Boone, who had spent most of his life walking dry country with a pick hammer, a measuring chain, and eyes that noticed what other men stepped over. He had never owned much. He had never dressed well, but he had known the bones of the earth the way some men knew scripture. When Ruth was a girl, he used to set stones on the kitchen table and tell her they were not stones at all, but letters from deep places. Most folks look at land and ask what it grows, he would say. A wiser soul asks what it remembers. For years, Ruth had thought those words were only poetry from a tired man. Then, after Thomas died, she found her father's journal again. Inside it was a rough map: Silver Bend, Dry Creek Ridge, Harrow Claim, black shale marks near the old wash, possible vein beneath East Slope, worth returning to when money allows. Money had never allowed. Not for her father, not for Thomas, and almost not for Ruth. That night in the boarding house room, Ruth sat by a lamp that hissed softly and read the page again until the words blurred. Wind pressed against the window. Downstairs, men laughed over supper. She heard her own name once, then the Harrow place, then another round of laughter. She did not cry. She had done enough crying in Kansas. Instead, she took off her gloves and opened her palm. A thin line of dirt still sat in the crease from where she had stopped along the road into town and rubbed a pinch of soil between her fingers. It had been dark, oily, and wrong for that stretch of pale grassland. Her father would have noticed. So had she. At dawn, Ruth walked to the Harrow place with her bag in one hand and the deed inside her coat. The house stood crooked against the open sky, gray boards bent by weather, porch sagging like tired shoulders. One window had lost its glass. The roof had a hole wide enough for rain, moonlight, and bad luck to enter together. A raven sat on the fence rail and watched her arrive. "Well," Ruth whispered, "I suppose you and I are neighbors now." The wind moved through the broken house with a low moan. Inside, dust covered the floor. A cracked blue cup sat near the cold stove, left behind by someone who had once believed they were staying. Ruth touched it with 2 fingers. Small things like that hurt worse than ruins. A cup meant hands. A cup meant mornings. A cup meant somebody had once waited for coffee here and hoped the day would be kind. By mid-morning, Ruth had swept one corner clean. She had tied her hair back, nailed a loose board across the window, and found the old well half hidden under tumbleweed. That was when she heard horses. Not 1. 4. Ruth stood slowly. A fine carriage rolled up the rutted road, black lacquer shining like a beetle's shell. 3 riders came behind it. The man who stepped down from the carriage wore a dark coat too clean for the trail and boots that had never known hunger. He carried his hat in one hand and an envelope in the other. He looked first at the house, then at Ruth. For a breath, he seemed disappointed. Then his eyes narrowed, because Ruth Mercer did not look like a woman easy to scare. "Mrs. Mercer," he called. She stayed beside the well. "That is my name. I am Silas Creed." She knew the name. Everyone in Silver Bend knew it. Cattle, rail contracts, banknotes, half the county under one rich man's shadow. Creed walked closer, smiling without warmth. "I heard you purchased this place yesterday." "News travels fast when folks have nothing better to carry," Ruth said. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked. Creed held out the envelope. "I will give you $10,000 for it." The wind stopped for a moment, or maybe Ruth only stopped hearing it. $10,000. Enough to pay every debt. Enough to buy a clean house in any town she wished. Enough to never again stand in front of laughing men with her last coins hidden in her glove. Ruth looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the old well. A faint smell rose from it, bitter mineral hidden. Her father's words moved through her mind like a hand on her shoulder. "Ask what the land remembers." "No," Ruth said. Silas Creed's smile faded. And behind him, one of his riders looked toward the east slope with the face of a man afraid. She had already found something. Creed did not speak right away. He looked at Ruth as if she had answered in a language he did not know. Men like Silas Creed were used to doors opening before they touched the handle. They were used to hands reaching for their envelopes before the price was named. They were not used to widows in dusty skirts standing beside broken wells and refusing enough money to change a life. "Perhaps you misunderstood me," he said. Ruth wiped her palm on her skirt. "I understood. $10,000, Mrs. Mercer. I heard the number. For a house that may not stand through winter. It stood through last winter." Creed's jaw tightened, but only a little. He was the kind of man who had practiced hiding anger because anger showed need, and need gave power to someone else. Behind him, the 3 riders waited. One was young and narrow-faced, with a scar near his chin. One was heavy through the shoulders, his eyes restless under the brim of his hat. The third man sat quieter than the others. He had a brown beard and a red kerchief tied at his neck. Ruth noticed him because he did not look at her much. He kept looking at the ground near the east slope. That told her more than Creed's envelope. The land mattered. Not the house, not the well, not the old fence posts leaning in the wind like tired bones. The land. Creed stepped closer. A woman alone should think carefully before refusing help. That sounds less like help and more like warning. It is advice. Then I will keep it with all the other things I did not ask for. The young rider gave a short laugh before catching himself. Creed turned his head slightly, and the laugh died. Ruth felt fear then. Not a large fear, not enough to move her feet, but enough to remind her that she was alone on 40 acres with 4 men, and no neighbor close enough to hear a call. The wind tugged at a loose strand of her hair. Her hand went to the edge of the well stones, fingers pressing against rough rock. Creed saw the movement. His voice softened. "Mrs. Mercer, I do not enjoy pressing a grieving woman. I knew your husband had passed. I am sorry for it." Ruth's face changed. Only a little. But Creed noticed, and she hated him for noticing. "Do not use my husband's grave as a step toward my front door," she said. For the first time, Silas Creed looked truly still. The heavy rider shifted his reins. The horses grew uneasy, feeling the mood of the men. A brown mare tossed her head and snorted at the dust. Creed lowered the envelope. "I will return tomorrow," he said. "You may save yourself the ride." "I doubt that." He turned, walked back to the carriage, and climbed in with the controlled care of a man trying not to slam the door. The riders followed him down the road, hooves thudding soft against the dirt. Ruth watched until they became dark shapes beyond the wash. Only then did she let herself breathe. Inside the broken house, she sat on the floor beside her bag and took out her father's journal. Her hands were steadier now, which almost made her smile. It was always the same with her. Fear came after the danger, not before it. During the danger, some hard, quiet place inside her took over. She opened to the page with the silver bend notes. There was no proper map, not the kind a surveyor would trust. Elias Boone had made it in pencil, with uneven lines and small marks only he and Ruth would understand. A curved wash, a shallow ridge, a patch of dark shale, a note about grasses dying in a thin strip despite spring rain. Ruth read the words again. Possible vein beneath east slope. Beside it in faded pencil, her father had written another line. Men with money will arrive after men with eyes. Ruth touched that sentence with her thumb. Her father had known. Maybe not the exact names, maybe not Creed, maybe not the date, but he had known what always happened when the earth whispered prophet. First came the dreamer. Then came the man with paper. Then came the man with muscle. By noon, Ruth walked the east slope. She carried a tin cup, a small hand spade left behind in the shed, and her father's old compass. The sun was high and white. It made the land look empty, but the closer she looked, the less empty it became. Ants moved near a cracked stone. Dry grass bent away from a low patch of ground. A faint dark stain marked the dirt where no shadow fell. Ruth knelt. She dug carefully. Not deep, just enough to loosen the top crust. The soil beneath was darker than it should have been. It clung to the spade in a greasy smear. She lifted it close and smelled it. Sharp, bitter, like lamp oil mixed with old pennies. Her heart began to beat harder. She wanted to laugh, but laughter would have felt too fragile in that wide silence. Instead, she sat back on her heels and looked toward the sky. "You were right, Pa," she whispered. The wind answered by moving over the ridge. For the first time since Thomas died, Ruth felt something inside her that was not grief, not anger, not survival. It was small and dangerous. Hope. She did not trust it yet. Hope had hurt her before. Hope had stood beside a sickbed and promised recovery. Hope had waited outside a bank and promised mercy. Hope had looked at a husband going to work one cold morning and never warned her he would not come back. So Ruth did not hold hope too tightly. She put the dark soil in the tin cup, covered it with a scrap of cloth, and took it back to the house. That afternoon, she went to Silver Bend. The town had already heard about Creed's visit. Ruth felt it in the way faces turned and voices dropped as she walked past the feed store. Men who had laughed yesterday now watched with curiosity. Women looked from porches with guarded sympathy, because frontier women knew the shape of trouble even when no one named it. At the telegraph office, Ruth wrote a message to a man named Jonah Bell in Cheyenne. "Need you at Silver Bend. regarding Boonfield notes, possible strike, bring testing kit, urgent but quiet, Ruth Mercer. Jonah Bell had been her father's last true friend, a surveyor with a bad leg and a worse temper. He had once told Ruth that most men who called themselves experts only knew how to repeat what richer men paid them to say. Elias Boone had trusted him, which was enough. The telegraph clerk read the message too slowly. Ruth placed one coin on the counter. Send it as written. He looked at her. Creed won't like that word getting out. Then send it before it reaches him. The clerk swallowed and began tapping. When Ruth left, she saw the quiet rider with the red kerchief standing across the street near the livery. He was pretending to tighten a saddle strap, but his eyes followed her from beneath his hat. She did not stop. She bought flour, coffee, nails, lamp oil, and the cheapest lock Mr. Avery had in his hardware store. It was not much of a lock, but it was better than trusting a chair against the door. Mr. Avery wrapped it in brown paper and leaned close. "You ought to sell," he said quietly. Ruth looked at him. His voice dropped lower. Not because the land ain't worth keeping, because Creed don't ask twice unless he means to own the answer. Ruth took the package, then he should learn to hear better. Avery sighed. Pride can get a person buried out here. So can surrender, Ruth said. She walked back before dusk, every step making the road feel longer. The flour sack pulled at her arm. Dusk gathered at the hem of her skirt. Far off, thunderheads built purple over the hills, though no rain reached the valley. Near the Harrow place she stopped. The front door was open. Ruth knew she had shut it. She set down the flour and stood very still. The house waited in silence. The loose board over the window tapped softly in the wind. A horse shifted somewhere beyond the rise, hidden from sight. Ruth picked up a fallen fence rail with both hands and walked toward the doorway. Inside, her few belongings had been moved, not destroyed, not scattered in wild anger, moved with care by someone looking for one particular thing. Her bag lay open. Her spare dress was unfolded. The cloth around her father's journal had been untied. But the journal was gone. For a moment, Ruth could not move. The room blurred at the edges, and the broken roof above her let in a strip of dying light. She saw her father's hands, rough and stained with dust, turning those pages. She saw Thomas wrapping the journal in cloth after the funeral because Ruth could not bear to touch it yet. Now it was gone. Then she saw something on the floor near the cold stove. A small piece of red thread. Ruth bent and picked it up. Outside, a horse gave a low sound. She turned toward the door just as a man's voice came from the shadows beyond the porch. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, quiet and rough, "if you want that book back, you must not sleep in this house tonight." Ruth held the fence rail tighter. The man stood just beyond the porch, where the last light could not fully reach him. She could see the shape of his hat, the line of his shoulders, and the red kerchief at his throat. It was the quiet rider from Creed's party. The same man who had watched the east slope more than he watched her. "You came into my house," Ruth said. "No, ma'am. You expect me to believe that. I expect you to stay alive long enough to learn who did." The words were not spoken like a threat. That troubled her more. A threat had heat in it. This man's voice carried warning, plain and heavy as a stone set on a grave. Ruth stepped onto the porch. The loose board creaked beneath her boot. "What is your name?" "Caleb Rusk." "You work for Silas Creed." His mouth tightened under the shadow of his hat. "I ride for him. That is not always the same as working for a man." That sounds like something a guilty man says when he wants to sound less guilty. Caleb looked down at the fence rail in her hands. "Maybe, but if I meant you harm, Mrs. Mercer, I would not have waited in the open." Ruth did not lower the rail. Behind Caleb, his horse stood near the broken fence, head lowered, reins loose. The animal looked tired, not from a short ride from town, but from being held ready too long. Ruth noticed the dust on Caleb's coat, the torn edge of his cuff, the way his right hand stayed near his side but not on his gun. "Where is my father's journal?" she asked. Caleb glanced toward the house, then toward the darkening road. "Creed's man took it." "Which man?" "Lennox, scar on his chin, meaner than he needs to be." Ruth remembered the young rider's narrow face. Why would he take it? "You know why." The answer settled between them. The east slope, the dark soil, the smell rising from the old well, the truth her father had seen years before any rich man came looking. Ruth felt a fresh ache rise in her chest, not the soft grief that came with missing Thomas, but the hot old hurt of seeing her father's life treated like something to steal. Elias Boone had been mocked by men with polished boots. He had died with maps under his bed and unpaid bills in a cracked bowl. Now one of those men wanted the only proof he had left behind. "What does Creed know?" Ruth asked. Caleb looked at her, and in the fading light she saw shame move across his face. "Enough to be afraid of what you know." A gust of wind pushed through the broken house behind her. The paper wrapping around the cheap locks scraped across the floor. Ruth suddenly felt how exposed the place was. The open window, the roof split above her, the road leading straight to her door. Still, she lifted her chin. "You said I should not sleep here tonight." "I did. Because Lennox will come back." Caleb's eyes moved to the dark line of cottonwoods near the wash. "Maybe Lennox, maybe another. Creed gives clean orders in daylight and lets dirty men decide how to obey them after sundown." Ruth studied him. "And you came here out of kindness?" "No." The blunt answer surprised her. Caleb took off his hat and held it at his side. His hair was dark and pressed flat from sweat. He looked younger without the brim hiding his face, but more tired too. "I came because your father once saved my brother's life." Ruth went still. "My father?" "Elias Boone, 10 years back, near Medicine Bow. My brother Wade was working a survey line when a bank gave way. Men were ready to leave him buried because the storm was coming in. Your father would not go, dug until his hands bled. Broke 2 fingers moving rock." Ruth saw it so clearly that for a moment she forgot the man in front of her. Her father, coat soaked through, jaw set, refusing to leave a living soul in the ground. That was him. Stubborn in science, stubborn in mercy. "He never told me," she said. "Wade did, many times." The fence rail grew heavy in Ruth's hands. Slowly she lowered it. Caleb watched the movement but did not smile. "Why ride for Creed then?" she asked. His face closed a little. "Debt, bad choices, a sick mother once. The kind of road a man starts walking and then pretends he does not know where it leads." It was not enough to make Ruth trust him, but it was enough to make her listen. Inside, the house darkened. The first stars appeared through the hole in the roof. Ruth went in, lit the lamp and set it on the table. Caleb stayed outside until she said, "If you have more to say, say it where I can see your face." He stepped in but kept near the door, as if he knew crossing too far into her home would be another kind of theft. Ruth picked up the red thread from the floor and held it out. Caleb's eyes moved to his own kerchief. For the first time he looked startled. "That is not mine." "It matches." "So it was meant to." The room seemed to shrink around her. Ruth hated that it made sense. Fear was easier when it had one face. Now it had several, and each wore a different reason. For a moment she wanted Thomas so sharply she almost turned toward the empty room as if he might be there. She wanted his hand on her shoulder. She wanted her father's calm voice telling her which sign mattered and which was only noise. Instead, there was only the lamp flame trembling in the draft and a stranger at her door with guilt in his eyes. If this moment makes you wonder who Ruth should trust, stay with her a little longer, because on the frontier, The first hand reaching out was not always the hand that meant to save you. "Where would I go?" Ruth asked. "Mrs. Bell's boarding house." "They will watch there." "Yes." "Then no." Caleb frowned. "No. If they expect me to run to town, I will not do it. This is not pride, it is danger. I know the difference." "Do you?" The question was sharp enough to sting. Ruth looked at him. "I have buried a husband, sold nearly every good thing I owned, ridden west with men laughing behind my back, and stood this morning while Selah's creed waved money in my face like I was a hungry dog. Do not stand in my broken house and teach me what danger feels like." Caleb lowered his eyes. For a few breaths neither spoke. Then Ruth went to her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was not the journal, but one page she had copied by lamplight before leaving Kansas. Her father's rough map of the East Slope. Not all of it, but enough. Caleb saw it and his expression changed. "They did not get everything," he said. "No," Ruth answered, "and tomorrow Jonah Bell arrives from Cheyenne." At that name Caleb's face hardened. "Creed will know before the train stops." "Then we meet Jonah before Creed does." "Wait." Ruth folded the paper and tucked it inside her sleeve. "You wanted to pay a debt to my father," she said. "Now you can." Outside, thunder rolled far off over the hills, though no rain had fallen. Caleb looked through the broken window toward the road, and Ruth followed his gaze. A lantern had appeared in the distance. Then another. Two small lights moving slowly toward the Harrow place. Ruth blew out the lamp. Darkness folded over the room at once, broken only by the pale strip of sky showing through the damaged roof. Outside, the two lanterns kept moving closer, swaying low and slow like yellow eyes above the road. Caleb stepped away from the window. "Get behind the stove," he whispered. Ruth did not move. "Who is it?" "Men who do not want to be seen clearly." "That tells me very little." "It tells you enough." He crossed to the door and eased it inward until only a narrow crack remained. Ruth heard the soft scrape of his boot against the floorboards. He had drawn no gun, but his whole body had changed. The tired guilt in him disappeared, replaced by stillness. Not the stillness of a calm man. The stillness of a man who had learned how quickly trouble could enter a room. Ruth crouched beside the cold stove, but she kept the fence rail near her hand. The lantern stopped at the broken gate. A voice called out, "Mrs. Mercer." Not Creed. Not Lennox. An older voice, thin and careful. Caleb frowned. Ruth rose just enough to see through the window. Two men stood near the fence. One held a lantern. The other leaned on a cane, his shoulders bent beneath a long coat. "That is Mr. Holly's," Ruth whispered. "The clerk." "Yes." Caleb did not relax. Why would a county clerk come here after dark? Ruth wondered the same thing. She stepped toward the door, but Caleb caught her wrist. His grip was firm, not rough. She looked down at his hand, then up at him. He let go. "Stand to the side when you open it," he said. Ruth did. The night air slipped in cold. Clerk Holly stood in the yard with his hat pressed against his chest. Beside him was a boy of maybe 17, his nephew from the look of him, all elbows and worry. "Mrs. Mercer," Holly said, squinting toward the dark doorway. "I know it is late. I would not have come if it could wait." "Most things can wait until morning," Ruth said. "This one cannot." Caleb stayed hidden in the black corner behind the door. Ruth could feel him there, silent as a shadow. Holly swallowed. He looked different than he had at the office, smaller somehow. The laughter had drained out of him, and without it his face showed fear plainly. "I made a mistake," he said. Ruth's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "About my deed." "No, your deed is sound. That is why I came." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. A man came to my office near dusk, scar on his chin. He wanted to see the Harrow file. Ruth's stomach turned. "Lennox," Caleb said from the shadows. Holly's jumped so hard the lantern shook. The boy beside him took a step back. "Who was there?" Holly's demanded. "A man listening," Caleb said. Ruth did not look at him. What did Lennox want? Holly's licked his lips. The old survey copies, transfer notes, anything that named Elias Boone. At her father's name, Ruth felt the room tilt. "You knew my father was in those papers." "No," Holly said quickly. "Not until tonight, I swear it. There was an old attachment in the file, a mineral observation, never formally recorded because no claim was paid on it. Your father signed it as witness back in 1886. Ruth stepped onto the porch. The boards bent under her weight. "Where is it?" Holly's looked down. That was answer enough. Ruth closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them. "He took it." "I tried to stop him." Caleb gave a low, bitter sound from inside the house. "I doubt he listened kindly." The clerk's nephew lifted the lantern higher. For the first time Ruth saw the bruise along Holly's cheek, darkening near one eye. The old man's hand trembled against his hat brim. Her anger softened, but only by a little. "Why bring this to me?" she asked. "Yesterday you laughed when I bought this land." Holly's looked ashamed. Real shame, not the kind men wore when caught. Because laughing at a woman's choice is one thing, helping a thief bury the truth is another. "I have done the first. I will not do the second." The words stayed in the cold air. Ruth believed him. Not fully, not without caution, but enough to hear the rest. Holly's reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, worn soft at the corners. "I found this behind the drawer lining after Lennox left. Must have slipped down years ago. It is not the survey, but it mentions it." He held it out. "It was addressed to Elias Boone, never mailed." Ruth took it carefully. Her father's name was written across the front in faded ink. For a moment the whole world became that envelope. The broken house vanished. Holly's vanished. Even Creed and Lennox faded from her mind. There was only the handwriting of a dead man reaching across the years. She wanted to tear it open. Instead, she carried it inside and lit the lamp again with shaking hands. Caleb came forward now and Holly saw him clearly. The clerk stiffened. "You ride for Creed," Holly said. "Not tonight," Caleb answered. Ruth broke the seal. The paper inside was brittle. She unfolded it with the care one gives to old lace or a wounded bird. The letter was short. The handwriting was cramped, as if written in haste. "Mr. Boone, you were right about the Harrow ground. The black shale line continues below the east slope. I fear Creed has learned of it and means to hide your report until he can take the claim. I have put a copy where only an honest need will find it. If anything happens to me, remember the well is not dead. It is only choked." The letter was signed Amos Harrow. Ruth read it twice. Then a third time. The old owner had not abandoned the land because it was worthless. He had known. He had tried to warn her father, and something had happened before that warning reached him. Caleb's face was hard in the lamplight. Creed has known longer than he admits. Holly's nodded. Amos Harrow disappeared that winter. Folks said he went east. "Did they find proof?" Ruth asked. "No." The answer chilled the room. Ruth folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. The grief she had carried for her father changed shape. It was no longer only sorrow for a man who had died poor and unheard. It was fury for a truth stolen before it could breathe. "Where would Harrow hide a copy?" she asked. Holly's looked at the broken floor, then toward the well outside. Caleb took the letter and read the final line again. "The well is not dead, it is only choked." Ruth turned toward the doorway. Outside, the night had grown deeper. The old well waited under the stars, its stones pale in the moonlight. Then from somewhere beyond the wash came the sharp crack of a branch breaking under a boot. Caleb moved first, pulling Ruth back from the open door. Holly's nephew whispered, "Someone followed us." Ruth looked down at the letter in her hand. For the first time, she understood that the secret was not just under her land. It was inside the well. Caleb pushed the door shut with one hand and caught the latch before it clicked. No one breathed for a moment. Outside, the night settled again, but it was not quiet anymore. Ruth could hear the difference. A true quiet had softness in it. This one listened back. Holly's nephew clutched the lantern so tightly his knuckles showed white. The flame inside jumped and trembled, throwing large shadows across the walls. Clerk Holly's leaned on his cane, face pale under the bruise near his eye. Caleb looked at Ruth. "Back room." "There is no back room," she whispered. "There is a corner pretending to be one." "Then pretend with it." Ruth almost argued, but the sound came again from beyond the wash. A faint scrape, then a low murmur too far to catch the words. Caleb took the lantern from the boy and turned the flame down, until the room fell into a dim amber haze. "How many?" Ruth asked. "Can't tell yet." "Lennox?" "Likely." Holly swallowed hard. "I should not have come." "No," Ruth said, folding Amos Harrow's letter and sliding it inside her bodice. "You should have come sooner." The old clerk looked at her, wounded by the truth of it. Ruth did not apologize. The frontier was too full of late conscience. A man could laugh at a woman in daylight, then come limping with the truth after dark, and both things could be real. But only one of them helped before the damage was done. Caleb opened the door a finger's width and listened. Ruth moved to the cracked window and looked through the gap in the board. Moonlight silvered the yard. The well stood 20 paces away, low and round, with tumbleweed caught against one side. Beyond it, the land dipped toward the wash. At first she saw nothing. Then a shadow moved between two cottonwoods. One man. Another shape followed. Ruth's hand found the edge of the window frame. A splinter bit into her palm, but she did not pull away. Caleb closed the door soundlessly. "Two that I can see, maybe more behind the wash." Holly's nephew whispered, "What do they want?" "The letter," Ruth said. "And the woman holding it," Caleb added. The boy's face lost all color. Caleb turned to him. "What is your name?" "Peter." "Peter, can you run quiet?" The boy stared. Holly's gripped his cane. "He is not bait." "No," Caleb said. "He is a messenger. If he can reach town, he goes straight to Sheriff Dane and tells him Lennox is trespassing on deeded land with stolen county papers." Ruth looked at Caleb. "You think the sheriff will come?" "I think he dislikes Creed less than he dislikes being made a fool in his own county." "That is not the same as courage." "No, but tonight it may be close enough." Peter looked from Caleb to Ruth, frightened but trying to stand taller. Ruth stepped to the small table, tore a strip from the brown lock paper, and took a pencil from her bag. She wrote fast. "Sheriff Dane, stolen county file, threat at Harrow Place, witnesses present. Ruth Mercer." She folded it and pressed it into Peter's hand. "Do not stop for anyone," she said. "If a writer calls your name, you do not have one. If a man says your uncle sent him, he did not. If you fall, get up before the dust knows you landed." Peter nodded, though his chin shook. Caleb led him to the rear wall, where broken boards left a narrow gap near the storage lean-to. "Go low until the sagebrush. Then run east of the road. Stay off the open track." Holly's caught the boy's sleeve before he slipped out. For a second, the old clerk's face broke with love and fear. "Peter," he whispered. "I know," the boy said, though Ruth was sure he did not know at all. Then he was gone. They waited. 1 breath. 2. No shout came, no shot, only the wind and the far-off whisper of Peter moving through grass. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Caleb was watching her. "You were hard on him," he said softly. "I needed him alive, not comforted." Caleb gave a small nod. "Your father had that way." Ruth looked at him sharply. "You knew him better than you first said." "I knew his name before tonight. I knew what he did for Wade. I heard stories." "That is not the same." "No." There was something he was not saying. Ruth felt it as surely as she felt the letter against her skin. Before she could press him, a voice called from the yard. "Mrs. Mercer." "Lennox." His tone carried an ugly kind of patience. Ruth moved toward the door, but Caleb held up a hand. Lennox called again. "No need for foolishness. Mr. Creed only wants what belongs in his file." Hollis whispered, "That paper was never his." Caleb's eyes stayed on Ruth. "Do not answer." But Ruth was tired of men coming to her door and deciding the terms of her silence. She stepped close to the wood, keeping her body to the side as Caleb had taught her. "This is private land," she called. "Leave it." Lennox laughed. "Land bought yesterday don't make a queen today." "It makes me the owner." "It makes you a widow in a house that won't keep out rain." Ruth's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Still better than being a thief hiding behind another man's money. The silence after that was dangerous. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, as if asking heaven for patience. Then Lennox said, "You have until I count 10. Ruth turned to Caleb. "What happens at 10? "He lies and starts at 6. A hard knock struck the door. Hollis flinched. Caleb crossed the room, lifted the loose stove pipe from the floor, and handed Ruth the fence rail. His voice lowered until only she could hear. "If they force in, stay behind me." "No. This is not the time." "It is exactly the time. I have stood behind men all my life and watched truth disappear over their shoulders." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face changed. Respect, perhaps, or worry becoming something softer. Outside, Lennox began counting. 1. The number rolled across the yard. 2. Ruth thought of Thomas, kind and tired, leaving for work before dawn. 3. She thought of her father, pockets full of stones, hands full of proof no one wanted. 4. She thought of Amos Harrow's letter and the dead well that was not dead. 5. The door shook under a kick. Before fear could claim her, another sound cut through the night. A whistle. Not from the yard, from far off near the road. Then another. Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Peter made it farther than I thought." Lennox cursed outside. Hooves sounded in the distance, more than one horse, coming fast from town. Ruth let out a breath she had not known she held. If you believe courage can begin with one frightened boy running through the dark, stay with this story, because sometimes the smallest brave act is the hinge on which a whole life turns. Lennox kicked the door again, harder this time. The old latch tore loose. The door burst inward. Caleb met the first man with the stove pipe across his arm, knocking him sideways into the wall. Ruth swung the fence rail low, not to wound but to stop, catching Lennox hard across the shin. He shouted and stumbled. Hollis, old and bruised as he was, brought his cane down across the wrist of the second man reaching for Ruth. The room filled with dust, grunts, and the wild jumping light of the lantern. Then a voice thundered from the yard. "Sheriff's office, hands where I can see them." Everyone froze except Lennox. He staggered backward through the doorway, eyes bright with rage, and looked straight at Ruth. "This land will bury you yet," he said. Then he ran into the dark toward the well. Ruth knew before Caleb moved. Lennox was not running away. He was running to destroy whatever Amos Harrow had hidden below. Ruth ran before anyone told her to stop. The yard opened cold around her, full of moonlight, dust, and shouting men. Sheriff Dane had ridden in with Peter and 2 deputies, but their horses were still sliding to a halt near the broken gate. Caleb came after Ruth, his boots striking the porch hard enough to shake the boards. Lennox was already at the well. He moved with the quick, desperate anger of a man who knew he had failed once and could not afford to fail twice. In his hand was a lantern. Its flame whipped bright in the wind as he lifted it over the dark mouth of the stones. "Lennox," Sheriff Dane shouted, "step away from there." Lennox looked over his shoulder. His face was twisted with pain from Ruth's strike, but his eyes held something worse than pain. "Creed said nobody gets what is down there," he snapped. Then he raised the lantern higher. Ruth understood at once. Not fire. The well was stone and damp below, but glass could break, oil could spill, flame could fall. If there were old papers hidden in a dry pocket, they would be gone before anyone could climb down. "No," Ruth cried. Caleb reached him first. He did not draw a weapon. He lowered his shoulder and drove into Lennox, knocking him away from the well. The lantern flew from Lennox's hand and struck the dirt. The glass cracked, but the flame died under its own spilled oil before it could catch. The 2 men hit the ground hard. Lennox kicked and cursed. Caleb held him down with one arm across his back until Sheriff Dane and a deputy pulled him up and tied his wrists. Lennox spat dust and tried to speak, but the sheriff pushed him toward the fence. "That is enough noise out of you," Dane said. Ruth stood beside the well, breathing hard. The stones were cold under her hand. She looked down into the black circle below. Nothing stared back, only darkness, deep and waiting. Peter came limping from the road, pale and out of breath, but alive. Hollis followed slower, leaning on his cane, his face full of the frightened pride of an uncle who had almost lost more than his dignity tonight. "You did well," Ruth told Peter. The boy swallowed and gave one small nod. He was trying not to smile and trying not to shake. He did both. Sheriff Dane came toward her. He was a broad man with tired eyes and a mustache that hid most of his mouth. Ruth had seen him once in town, sitting outside the jail with coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He had looked then like a man who preferred calm because calm meant less paperwork. Tonight he looked less lazy than she had guessed. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "that boy says you have proof of stolen county records." "I have a letter," Ruth said, "and Clerk Hollis can speak to the missing file." Dane looked at Hollis. The clerk straightened as much as his bruised face allowed. "I can, and I will." The sheriff's eyes moved to Caleb. "And you?" Caleb wiped dust from his mouth with the back of his hand. "I saw Lennox watching this place. I warned her." "You ride for Creed." "I did." "That answer has a short future unless you explain it better." Caleb said nothing. Ruth noticed the way his jaw locked. There it was again, the hidden thing he carried but would not set down. Sheriff Dane turned back to the well. "What is supposed to be down there?" "A copy of a mineral report," Ruth said. "Maybe more." "At the bottom." "Not the bottom," Caleb spoke now, quiet. "The old wells around here sometimes had side pockets cut into the stone lining. Folks used them to keep food cool or hide valuables. If Amos Harrow hid papers, he would not put them where water could eat them." Ruth looked at him. "You knew that?" "My brother worked wells before he worked surveys." Sheriff Dane rubbed a hand over his face. "Of course he did." The deputy brought rope from his saddle. The well was tested first with a stone and a long pause. It struck water, but not deep. Caleb tied the rope around his waist and checked the knot twice. Ruth stepped forward. "I am going down." "No," Caleb said. "It is my land." It is also a narrow well with broken stones, and a man waiting in irons who would enjoy hearing you fell. "I am smaller than you." and less used to climbing stone in the dark. Ruth hated that he was right. Caleb lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Let me do this much, not for creed, not for debt, for your father." That stopped her. She stepped back. The deputies lowered him slowly into the well. The rope scraped over the stones. Caleb's boots found holds along the old lining, and his body disappeared inch by inch into the dark. Ruth held the lantern over the mouth, careful and steady, though her arms ached. "Tell me what you see," she called. "Stone," Caleb answered from below. His voice echoed. "Roots, bad workmanship." "That is not helpful." "It is honest." Despite everything, Ruth almost smiled. The rope shifted. Then Caleb went quiet. Ruth's heart climbed into her throat. "Caleb." One moment. She heard stone scrape, then a grunt, then silence again. Sheriff Dane leaned closer. "Rusk." Caleb's voice came up changed. "There is a pocket cut into the east side." Ruth gripped the lantern handle. More scraping followed. Something old cracked loose. Dust rose from the well in a faint, dry breath, carrying the smell of stone, mud, and years shut away from the sun. Caleb called up, "There is a tin box." Ruth closed her eyes. For a moment, she saw her father at the kitchen table, setting stones in rows for her to study. She saw Thomas laughing when she told him dirt could talk. She saw every man in Silver Bend laughing at $12. Then Caleb said, "The lid is sealed. I am bringing it up." The deputies pulled slowly. First came Caleb's hand, scraped white with dust. Then his hat. Then the tin box hugged against his chest. Ruth helped him over the stones, and when his boots touched ground, he placed the box in her hands as if it were a newborn child. It was smaller than she expected. A plain tin biscuit box, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with wire. The metal had rusted at the edges, but the seal held. Hollies whispered, "Lord have mercy." Ruth knelt in the dirt and opened it with Caleb's knife. Inside lay folded papers, dry and yellowed, along with a small leather pouch and a photograph faded nearly silver. The top paper bore her father's name. Elias Boone. Below it, in careful ink, were the words "Mineral Observation of Harrow East Slope." Ruth pressed her hand over her mouth. No one laughed now. Sheriff Dane took off his hat. Hollies bowed his head. Even the deputies stood quiet, as if the dead had stepped into the yard and asked to be heard. Ruth lifted the paper with trembling fingers. But beneath the report was another letter. This one was addressed not to Elias Boone. It was addressed to Ruth herself, though the handwriting belonged to a man who had died before she ever came west. To the daughter of Elias Boone, if she should ever stand where her father once stood. Ruth stared at the line until the words blurred. Caleb knelt beside her, his voice gentle, "Mrs. Mercer." She did not answer. Because whatever Amos Harrow had hidden in that well, he had not hidden it only for her father. He had been waiting for her. Ruth did not open the letter at once. For a long moment she only held it while the night wind moved softly over the yard. The paper felt thin between her fingers, almost too fragile to carry the weight of a dead man's warning. Above her, the stars looked cold and bright. Around her, no one spoke. Even Lennox had gone quiet near the fence, his wrists tied, his face turned away from the sheriff's lantern. Caleb knelt beside Ruth but did not reach for the letter. That mattered to her. Every man who wanted the land had reached for something that belonged to her. Caleb only waited. Sheriff Dane cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer, we may need that as evidence." "You will have it," Ruth said, "after I read it." No one argued. She unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was older than the first letter, less steady in places, as if Amos Harrow had written it with tired hands and little time. Ruth held it near the lantern and began to read. "Miss Boone, if this paper finds you grown, Then I pray your father lived long enough to tell you he was right." Ruth stopped at the first line. "Miss Boone." Not Mrs. Mercer, not widow, not the name grief had left her. Boone, her father's name, the name she had been born with, the name that had taught her to kneel in dirt and listen. She swallowed hard and read on. "Your father saw what others laughed at. The east slope holds more than dry grass. I saw the signs after he left and wished I had trusted him sooner. Mr. Creed came to me with money, then with papers, then with men who smiled too little. He wanted the land quiet until he could take it clean. I refused him once. I do not know if I shall get the chance to refuse him twice." The wind lifted the edge of the paper. Ruth held it tighter. "If I am gone and your father returns, tell him the report is hidden in the old well. If your father is gone and you stand here in his place, then know this. A poor man's truth does not die just because a rich man buries it. The land remembers, so must you." Ruth could not read the last line aloud. She lowered the letter. The yard blurred in front of her. She hated tears when men were watching, but these came before pride could stop them. Not wild tears, not loud ones, just two quiet lines down a dust-streaked face. Her father had not been a fool. He had not been only a dreamer with rocks in his pockets and unpaid bills on the table. Someone had known. Someone had written it down. Someone had waited for the daughter of Elias Boone to come and finish what he could not. Caleb stood slowly and turned away, giving her the small mercy of not staring. Sheriff Dane took the mineral report and held it under the lantern. Hollis leaned close, his old eyes moving across the page. "This is witnessed," Hollis said. "Signed, dated." "Enough for court?" Ruth asked. Hollis looked at the sheriff. Dane rubbed his thumb along his jaw. "Enough to make Creed sweat, maybe enough to make him careless." "That is not the same as justice." "No," Dane said, "but it is a road toward it." Ruth folded Amos Harrow's letter and tucked it back into the tin box. The leather pouch inside caught her eye. She opened it and poured the contents into her palm. A small brass key. No label, no note, just a key worn smooth at the edges. Hollis bent closer. "That looks like a bank box key." "Silver Bend Bank?" Ruth asked. "Could be, old style." Caleb's face changed. Ruth saw it. "What do you know?" she asked. He did not answer fast enough. Sheriff Dane noticed too. Rusk. Caleb looked toward the road, where the dark line of town sat beyond the sleeping fields. "Creed keeps a private box at the bank. So did Amos Harrow, before folks said he left." Ruth closed her fingers around the key. "Then we go at first light." "No," Caleb said, "not openly." Ruth stood. "I am tired of hiding from men who steal in the dark. And I am tired of watching honest people walk straight into traps because daylight makes them feel safe." His voice rose more than he meant it to. The yard went still again. Ruth looked at him closely. "This is where you tell me the rest." Caleb's shoulders lowered, as if something heavy inside him had finally slipped. He looked at Sheriff Dane, then at Hollis, then back to Ruth. "My brother Wade did not die of fever like I told folks." Ruth said nothing. Caleb's eyes carried the shame of a man walking barefoot over old glass. "He worked for Creed 3 years ago, not as muscle, as a survey hand. Wade found an old mention of Harrow's bank box in Creed's papers. He thought there might be proof Creed had stolen claims before." "What happened to him?" Ruth asked softly. Caleb looked down at his hands. "He vanished on the South Trail. His horse came back with an empty saddle." The words settled over Ruth with a cold weight. "I went to Creed," Caleb continued. "I was angry enough to be stupid. Creed said he knew nothing. Then he offered work, good pay, steady pay, said a man close to him might learn more than a man shouting from the road." "So you rode for him to find out what happened?" "At first. And after." Caleb's mouth tightened. After, I stayed because leaving meant admitting I had become useful to the man I hated. That was the truth. Ruth heard it plainly. It did not make him innocent, but it made him human. Lennox laughed once from near the fence. "Ain't that sweet?" Sheriff Dane struck the fence rail beside Lennox with his boot. "Speak again, and I will find a quieter place for you." Lennox shut his mouth, but his eyes shone mean in the lantern light. Ruth turned back to Caleb. "Did you know Creed planned to take my journal?" "No." "Did you know he wanted my land before I bought it?" "Yes." The answer hurt more because he did not soften it. Ruth looked toward the broken house, then across the east slope. The land seemed different now, not richer, not safer, more awake. "My father's journal is still gone," she said. Caleb nodded, "And Creed has it." Sheriff Dane lifted the tin box, "But not this." "No," Ruth said, "not this." From the road came the sound of a horse running hard. Everyone turned. A deputy raised his rifle, but did not aim. The rider came out of the dark, bent low over the saddle. It was a young woman in a blue dress, her hair loose from its pins, riding as if fear itself had tied spurs to her heels. She pulled the horse up so sharply it nearly reared. "Sheriff," she cried. Ruth knew her, Clara Bell, daughter of the boarding house owner. Clara's face was white in the moonlight. "Creed is at the bank," she gasped. "He has Mr. Avery opening it now, and he has Mrs. Bell locked inside with them." For one breath, no one moved. Then Sheriff Dane swore under his breath and turned toward the road. "Deputies, bring Lennox. Hollies, stay with the papers." "No," Holly said, surprising everyone, including himself. "I am coming." Dane looked at the old clerk's bruised face and cane. "You can barely stand." "I stood long enough in the wrong places. I can stand once in the right one." Ruth closed the tin box and handed it to Clara Bell. "Take this to your mother's pantry if you can get home. Hide it behind the flour barrel." Clara shook her head fast. "My mother is in the bank. And if we fail, this must not be." Clara stared at the box as if Ruth had placed a beating heart in her hands. Then she nodded, tucked it under her shawl, and rode back toward town by the side road Holly showed her. Ruth mounted behind Caleb because there was no spare horse and no time for pride. His mare surged forward beneath them, muscles bunching hard as they flew over the moonlit road. Ruth held the back of his coat, feeling the dust and old sweat in the cloth. The wind stung her eyes. The town lamps ahead glowed small and yellow, like candles set out for the dead. Caleb did not look back, but he spoke over the rush of hooves. "When we reach town, stay behind the sheriff. You keep giving advice I did not ask for. And you keep surviving by ignoring half of it." Despite the fear clawing at her ribs, Ruth almost smiled. Almost. Silver Bend appeared quiet at first. Too quiet. No piano from the saloon. No laughter near the hotel porch. Even the dogs seemed to know something had gone wrong. The bank stood at the corner of Main and Lark, a brick building with iron bars on the windows and Creed's black carriage waiting outside. A lamp burned inside. The front door was shut. Sheriff Dane arrived moments after Caleb, his deputies dragging Lennox between them. Lennox's face changed when he saw the carriage. "Too late," he muttered. Dane shoved him toward a hitching post. "Tie him." Ruth slid down from the horse before Caleb could help her. Her boots struck the ground hard. Across the street, curtains moved in dark windows. People were awake. People were watching, but fear kept every door closed. That angered her more than she expected. How many times had men like Creed won simply because decent folks watched from behind curtains? Sheriff Dane stepped toward the bank. "Creed, this is Sheriff Dane, open the door." A silence followed. Then Silas Creed's voice came from inside, smooth and cold. "Sheriff, you are interrupting private banking business." "At midnight." "Urgent business." Ruth stepped beside the sheriff. Dane gave her a warning look, but she ignored it. "Where is Mrs. Bell?" she called. A pause. Then Mrs. Bell's voice answered, thin but steady. "I am all right, Ruth." Ruth's heart clenched. The boarding house widow had been kind to her without asking questions. A clean room, hot coffee, a look that said she understood grief without needing to name it. Creed spoke again. "No one is harmed. Let me finish what I came for, and this ends quietly." Caleb moved closer to Ruth. "He is looking for the bank box." "The key is not with him," Ruth whispered. "No, but Avery can open boxes if forced." From inside came a sharp sound, metal striking metal. Ruth stepped toward the door. Sheriff Dane caught her arm. "Do not. He has my father's journal. And a hostage. Mrs. Bell is not a shield for his theft." "No, but she is flesh and blood, and papers are not." Ruth stopped because he was right, and she hated him for being right. Caleb leaned close. "There is a rear entrance." Dane looked at him, locked. "Usually barred from inside." "Usually." Caleb's eyes shifted toward the alley. Avery smokes out back when his wife thinks he is balancing accounts. He leaves the side window loose. The sheriff stared at him. Caleb shrugged. A man learns things riding for the wrong people. Dane pointed to one deputy. "With me." Caleb turned to Ruth. "Stay here." She looked straight at him. "No." "Ruth." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it struck her strangely, not like an order, like fear slipping past his guard. She softened only a little. "I will not go inside, but I will not stand where I cannot see." Caleb held her gaze, then nodded once. He and the sheriff disappeared into the alley with one deputy. The remaining deputy kept his rifle trained on the bank door while Lennox watched with a cruel, knowing smile. Ruth stood in the street under the pale moon. Then she heard Mrs. Bell cry out. Not loudly, not in pain perhaps, but in fear. Ruth moved before thought could catch her. She crossed the boardwalk and placed both hands on the bank door. "Mr. Creed," she called, loud enough for every dark window to hear. "You came to my land with $10,000 because you thought I was alone. You sent men to steal my father's book because you thought the dead had no witnesses. You locked a widow in a bank because you thought this town would stay afraid." Curtains shifted. A door opened somewhere down the street. Ruth's voice shook now, but it did not break. "You were wrong." Inside the bank, something heavy fell. Then the back of the building erupted with shouting. The front door burst open. Mr. Avery stumbled out first, his spectacles hanging crooked. Mrs. Bell came next, pushed forward by Creed's arm across her shoulders. He held no gun to her head, but he gripped her hard enough that Ruth saw pain flash across the woman's face. Creed's other hand clutched a leather ledger and Ruth's father's journal. The sight of it stole her breath. The worn brown cover, the cloth tie Thomas had wrapped around it, her father's life in one rich man's fist. "Back away," Creed said. Sheriff Dane came from the alley behind him, pistol drawn. Caleb was at his side. "No road out," Dane said. Creed's smile was thin. "There is always a road for a man with enough money." Then Clerk Hollies stepped from the darkness near the bank wall. "No," he said. His voice was not loud, but everyone heard it. Creed looked at him with disgust. "Move, old man." Hollies lifted a paper in one trembling hand. "I copied the Harrow file 3 years ago when you first asked after it. I thought you were only greedy then. Tonight proved you criminal." Creed's face changed. So did the town. One by one, doors opened. Mr. Avery's wife stepped onto the boardwalk with a lantern. The blacksmith came from his shop, hammer still in hand. 2 men from the saloon appeared, then 3 women from the hotel, then Clara Bell at the far corner with the tin box held tight beneath her shawl. Fear did not leave Silver Bend all at once. It loosened, person by person. If this moment touches your heart, remember Ruth was never asking the town to fight for riches. She was asking them to stop looking away while truth was being stolen. Creed saw the crowd and understood what had changed. Not the law, not the papers, witnesses. His grip on Mrs. Bell tightened. Caleb stepped forward, let her go. Creed looked at him. You forget who paid your debts. No, Caleb said, I remember too well. His voice carried through the street. You paid my debts after my brother found your trail of stolen claims. You gave me work so you could watch me. Wade Rusk did not run off. He found Harrow's bank record and the next day he vanished. A murmur passed through the crowd. Creed's face hardened. You have no proof. Ruth stepped forward, eyes fixed on the journal in his hand. Maybe not yet, she said, but men who steal truth always leave marks trying to hide it. At that moment, Mrs. Bell drove her heel down on Creed's boot. He grunted and loosened his hold. Caleb moved fast, pulling her free. Sheriff Dane caught Creed's wrist. The ledger fell. The journal struck the street and slid through the dust to Ruth's feet. She dropped to her knees and gathered it to her chest. For a moment, the whole town vanished. She could smell old leather, dust, and the faint pine soap Thomas had packed it with months ago. Her father's journal was back in her hands. Then a brass key slipped from between its pages and landed in the dirt. Not the key from the well. Another one, smaller, newer. Caleb picked it up and turned it over. On one side, scratched into the metal, were 2 words. Wade Rusk. Caleb held the small key like it had burned him. The whole street seemed to draw closer around that little piece of brass. Lanterns swayed in the night wind. Faces watched from the boardwalks, pale and silent. Ruth stayed on her knees with her father's journal pressed to her chest, staring at the 2 scratched words. Wade Rusk. For a moment, Caleb looked less like a man, and more like a boy who had just heard his brother call from another room. Where did you get that? His voice was low. Creed stood between Sheriff Dane and the deputy, one wrist already bound. His coat was dusty now, his hair loosened from its careful part. Still, he tried to look bored, as if the town had gathered merely to interrupt his evening. I have no knowledge of that key, Creed said. Caleb stepped toward him. Sheriff Dane lifted a hand. Easy. But Caleb did not reach for Creed. He only held up the key. My brother's name is on this. Many men have brothers, Creed said. And yours keep disappearing when they find your ledgers. The crowd stirred. Ruth rose slowly. Dust clung to her skirt. She looked at the key, then at the bank door behind Creed. Mr. Avery, she said, does that key belong to a box here? The banker stood under the bank lamp, rubbing one wrist where Creed had gripped him. His spectacles were still crooked, but his voice steadied when he saw half the town watching. It might, Avery said. I would need to check the register. Creed's head turned sharply. You will do no such thing without a court order. Sheriff Dane tightened his hold on Creed's arm. A man who breaks into a bank at midnight does not get to lecture us on proper procedure. I did not break in. Mr. Avery opened the door. With my wife held outside by one of your men, Avery snapped. For the first time since Ruth had met him, Silas Creed looked at the town and found no easy place to set his power. No bowed heads, no nervous smiles, no one pretending not to hear. Ruth stepped close to Caleb and held out her hand. May I? Caleb looked at the key for one more breath, then placed it in her palm. His hand was cold. Inside the bank, the air smelled of lamp oil, paper, and fear. Drawers hung open behind the counter. A ledger lay on the floor where Creed had dropped it. Mrs. Bell sat in a chair near the wall, Clara kneeling beside her, holding both her hands. The older woman gave Ruth a tired nod that tried to be brave and nearly broke Ruth's heart. Mr. Avery went behind the counter and pulled out a thick register book. His finger moved down the page, stopped, moved again, then stopped for good. "Box 17, he said quietly. Caleb closed his eyes. Ruth watched him. "What is it?" 17 was Wade's lucky number, he said. He wore it on his saddle tag when we were boys. Avery led them to the iron box cabinet behind the teller's cage. His hands shook as he fitted the key. It turned with a small, clean click. The sound was almost gentle. He pulled the box out and set it on the counter. No one reached for it. Then Caleb said Ruth should open it. Ruth looked at him. "It was hidden in your father's journal," he said. "Maybe Wade meant it to reach you." Ruth set the journal down with care and opened the metal box. Inside were 3 things: a folded letter, a packet of signed papers tied with black thread, and a small photograph of 2 young men standing beside a mule, grinning like the world had not yet taught them caution. One was Caleb, younger and thinner, with no sorrow in his eyes. The other had the same jaw, the same dark hair, and a smile so open it hurt to look at. Caleb touched the photograph with one finger. "Wade," he whispered. Ruth opened the letter. "Brother, if you are reading this, then I was right to hide what I found and wrong to think I could carry it alone." Caleb turned away, one hand covering his mouth. Ruth read softly, but the room was quiet enough that everyone heard. "Creed has been buying dead claims through false companies and waiting for poor landowners to abandon what they do not know they own. Harrow's place is the worst of it. Elias Boone found the truth first. Harrow tried to protect it. Creed buried the report, then made sure no honest buyer would touch the land until he could take it for nothing." Ruth paused. Creed stood rigid near the doorway. She kept reading. "I found the transfer papers in Creed's private ledger. Some are forged. Some are frightened men signing what they did not understand. The Harrow mineral right was never his. If the Boone daughter ever comes, help her. Her father was right, and that land should not be stolen twice." The last line was written darker than the rest, pressed hard into the paper. "Caleb, do not let my bad end become your bad life." The room was silent. Caleb bowed his head. His shoulders shook once, but he made no sound. Ruth folded the letter and placed it on the counter. She wanted to say something kind, but some grief did not want words laid over it too quickly. So she only stood beside him, close enough that he would know he was not alone, far enough that his sorrow remained his. Sheriff Dane opened the packet of papers. His tired eyes sharpened as he read. "Hollies," he called. The old clerk stepped forward and took one sheet. He studied the signatures, then another, then another. The color drained from his face. "These are transfers," he said. "Mineral claims, surface waivers, some stamped through companies that no longer exist." "Can you prove they are false?" Ruth asked. Hollies looked toward Creed. "Some of these men were dead before the dates written here." A sound moved through the bank, half gasp, half anger. Creed finally spoke. "Old paperwork errors do not make a crime." "No," Ruth said, "but dead men signing papers do." His eyes cut toward her, cold and full of hate, but she did not look away. Sheriff Dane took the packet and handed it to his deputy. "Silas Creed, you are coming with me." Creed laughed once, sharp and empty. "And when the territorial judge asks what proof you have that I harmed Wade Rusk?" Caleb lifted his head. The question landed hard. The papers proved theft, fraud, greed. They proved Creed had reason to fear Wade. They did not prove what happened on the South Trail. Creed knew it. Ruth saw victory trying to return to his face. Then Mrs. Bell spoke from her chair. "Ask Lennox." Everyone turned. Lennox stood outside the bank window, tied near the post under guard. His face, visible through the glass, had gone gray. Mrs. Bell's voice trembled, but she continued. When they had me inside, Lennox thought no one was listening. He told Mr. Creed the Old South Trail secret would stay buried if the widow stopped digging. Caleb went still. Creed's face darkened. A frightened woman misheard. Mrs. Bell stood, Clara helping her. "No, I have listened to boarders whisper through thin walls for 20 years. I know when a man says what he means." Sheriff Dane walked outside with slow purpose. Ruth followed to the doorway, her father's journal in her arms. The whole town watched as Dane stopped in front of Lennox. The scar-chinned man's mouth worked, but no words came. Dane said, "You have one chance to tell the truth before Creed decides you are the last loose end he owns." Lennox looked at Creed. Creed gave him nothing. No loyalty, no rescue, no promise. Only silence. Something broke in Lennox's face. He swallowed, eyes shifting toward the dark road south of town. "Wade Rusk left something else," he whispered, "something Creed never found." Caleb stepped forward, barely breathing. Lennox looked at Ruth then, as if all roads had somehow led back to the widow with $12 and a ruined house. "It is under the old mile marker on the South Trail," he said, "and if she opens it, Creed hangs in every court from here to Cheyenne." By dawn, half of Silver Bend stood on the South Trail. The sky had not yet turned blue. It held that pale gray hush that comes before sunrise, when the world seems to be deciding whether it has strength enough to begin again. Ruth rode beside Caleb in Sheriff Dane's wagon, her father's journal on her lap and Amos Harrow's tin box tucked beneath the seat. Across from her sat Clerk Hollies, wrapped in an old coat, looking as if the night had aged him 5 years and freed him from 10. Behind them, Silas Creed rode in irons between 2 deputies. He said nothing. That silence told Ruth more than his threats ever had. A guilty man often shouted while he still believed power could save him. Creed had stopped shouting. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, and every time the wagon wheels struck a rut, his jaw tightened as if the earth itself had begun speaking against him. Lennox had told them where to go. 3 miles south of town, beyond a dry creek bed and a leaning cottonwood split by lightning, stood an old mile marker half buried in dust. Most travelers passed it without looking. It was only a stone post, weather-cut and plain, with the number 7 carved into one side. Caleb stepped down first. He stood before the marker for a long moment, and Ruth knew he was not seeing stone. He was seeing his brother's last ride, the empty saddle, the questions that had followed him for years like wolves behind a wounded horse. Ruth climbed down and came beside him. "You do not have to do this alone," she said. Caleb looked at her. His face was worn from sleeplessness, dust, and grief, but something in him had changed. The shame was still there, but it no longer ruled his eyes. "I know," he said. Those 2 words felt like a door opening. Sheriff Dane handed Caleb a shovel. The first strike bit into the dry ground with a hard sound, then another, then another. Ruth took a second shovel before anyone could stop her and dug beside him. Her palms burned, dirt caught beneath her nails. The hem of her skirt dragged in the dust, but she kept digging because some truths should not be unearthed by strangers alone. After a foot of hard soil, Caleb's shovel struck wood. He froze. Ruth knelt and brushed dirt away with both hands. A small strongbox lay beneath the marker, wrapped in rotted canvas. Caleb lifted it out as if lifting a memory from a grave. The key from Wade's bank box opened it. Inside was a leather notebook, a blood-stained survey tag, and a signed confession written in Wade Rusk's own hand. The words were plain and terrible. Wade had found Creed's forged claim papers. He had hidden copies at the bank and carried the final proof south to meet a territorial marshal. Lennox and another man had followed him. Creed had not held the knife, had not pulled the trigger, had not dirtied his fine coat. But Creed had ordered the road cleared. There it was, written by a dying man who had known he might not be found in time. Caleb read only half before his voice failed. Sheriff Dane took the page and finished it aloud. By then, the sun had begun to rise behind the hills, laying gold across the trail and turning every watching face clear. Creed tried once to speak. No one listened. That morning did not bring a hanging. It did not bring wild revenge or men firing guns in the street. It brought something quieter and stronger. It brought papers placed in lawful hands. It brought witnesses who had finally stopped hiding behind curtains. It brought a rich man sitting in the back of a sheriff's wagon with dust on his boots and fear in his throat. By noon, Silas Creed was locked in the jail he had once treated like an office he could visit and leave at will. By evening, telegrams were sent to Cheyenne, Denver, and the territorial court. Within weeks, the forged claims began to fall apart. Families who had lost land came forward. Men who had signed under pressure found their courage once they learned they had not been alone. Mr. Avery opened records he had been too frightened to question. Hollis gave sworn statements until his hand ached. Mrs. Bell testified with her back straight and her daughter's hand in hers. Lennox traded what he knew for a smaller cell and a longer life. Silas Creed lost his companies first, then his friends, then the polished name he had spent years building over stolen ground. Justice did not arrive like thunder. It came like weather changing, slow and certain, until the whole valley felt different under it. And Ruth Mercer kept the Harrow place. The first working well came in before winter. It did not burst like a wild legend told in saloons. It rose steady and black from the earth, a deep hidden river of value that men had tried to bury under lies. Ruth stood beside it with her father's journal in her arms. Caleb stood a few feet away, hat in hand, watching the oil climb into daylight. No one laughed at $12 anymore. Ruth used the first profits to repair the house. Not all at once. She wanted her hands in the work. She replaced the roof, mended the porch, cleared the well, and hung Amos Harrow's letter in a frame beside her father's map. The cracked blue cup stayed on the kitchen shelf, not because it was useful, but because it reminded her that abandoned places were not always empty. Sometimes they were waiting for someone stubborn enough to return life to them. Clerk Hollis came one afternoon with the original deed. He had framed it himself. "I laughed when you bought it," he said, unable to meet her eyes. Ruth took the frame and looked at the paper inside. $12, Harrow claim, Ruth Mercer. "Yes," she said, "you did." "I am sorry." She let the silence sit long enough for the apology to learn its own weight. Then she nodded. "Do better next time a woman knows something you do not." Hollis gave a small, ashamed smile. "I believe I will." Caleb did not leave Silver Bend. For a while, he slept in the bunkhouse and worked the land with quiet discipline, never asking Ruth for more than a day's wage and a chance to be useful. Some evenings, she would find him by the south fence, looking toward the trail where Wade's truth had waited under stone. One cold evening, Ruth brought him coffee. "Your brother saved me," she said. Caleb held the cup in both hands. "You saved him from being forgotten." The wind moved softly between them. After a moment, Ruth said, "Maybe that is what the living owe the dead." Caleb looked at her, and this time there was no shame hiding in his eyes. Only grief, gratitude, and something tender neither of them was ready to name. Spring came green along the wash. The Harrow place became the Boone Mercer field because Ruth refused to let her father's name remain buried in old papers. On the day the new sign was raised, the town gathered without being asked. Mrs. Bell brought pies. Peter carried nails. Hollis read the deed aloud, voice clear and proud. Caleb drove the final post into the ground while Ruth stood beside him, her gray eyes bright in the sun. At the end of the day, when the others had gone, Ruth walked to the old well. The same well men had called dead. She looked down into its cool darkness and thought of Elias Boone, Amos Harrow, Wade Rusk, and Thomas Mercer. Men who had loved, warned, worked, and vanished, leaving behind pieces of truth for her to gather. Then she looked across the land. The repaired house glowed in the sunset. A lantern moved gently in the porch wind. Caleb's horse grazed near the fence. The new sign stood straight against the golden sky. Ruth placed one hand on her father's journal and smiled. If this story stayed with you, carry this thought with you too. Sometimes the world calls a thing worthless only because it has not yet met the person brave enough to understand its value. And in Silver Bend, folks would tell it for years, how a widow spent her last $12 on a ruined homestead and bought back not just land, but truth, justice, and the future her father had always believed was waiting beneath the dust.